My parents said I'd never make a living playing video games. 5 years later, they asked me to pay off their mortgage. My name is Ryan, and growing up, my parents treated my passion for gaming like it was a disease they needed to cure. Every report card, every family dinner, every holiday, it was the same lecture. You're wasting your life. No one makes money staring at a screen. You need a real career, Ryan. My dad, David, was a mechanic who worked with his hands his whole life, and to him, if you couldn't hold it or fix it, it wasn't real work. He'd grown up with a father who told him the same thing about wrenches and engines, and somewhere along the way that idea calcified into the only definition of real work he was ever willing to accept. My mom, Jennifer, was gentler about it, but just as consistent. She didn't yell like my dad did. He just worried out loud constantly in that quiet way that somehow felt heavier than shouting. She'd bring it up while folding laundry, while driving me to school, while we sat at the dinner table on nights my dad worked late. "I just don't want you to wake up at 30 with nothing to show for it," she'd say, and I never had a good enough answer to make that worry go away. At the time I was 12, I was already spending hours after school playing competitive shooters online, and by 14 I'd figured out how to record and edit my own clips, uploading them to whatever platform would let a young teenager build an audience without much oversight. It started as a way to feel like I was good at something, because school had never really been my strength and sports never clicked for me the way they seemed to for other kids. Gaming was different. Could put in hours and actually see myself improve. I could study other players, break down their decision-making, understand positioning and timing the same way I imagined my dad understood torque specs and engine timing. Nobody in my family saw it that way, though. To them, it was just noise coming from behind a closed door. By 17, I was streaming regularly after school, building a small but loyal audience playing competitive shooters. Wasn't making much, maybe enough for pizza money and to slowly upgrade my setup piece by piece, but I loved every second of it. I loved the community that formed in my chat, regulars who showed up night after night, people who'd tell me about their day the same way I'd tell them about mine. I loved the feeling of getting slightly better every single week, shaving fractions of a second off my reaction time, learning new strategies, adapting to patches and metas the way a chess player studies openings. None of that mattered to my parents. When I told them I wanted to pursue streaming and esports instead of going straight to a 4-year college, my dad nearly threw his coffee mug across the kitchen. "You will not make a living playing video games," he said, his voice low and hard in a way that scared me more than yelling would have. "That's not a job. That's a hobby for kids who don't want to grow up. You think people just get paid to sit around? You think the world works like that?" I tried to explain the numbers to him, subscriber growth, ad revenue splits, the sponsorship deals other creators my size were starting to land, but he waved it all away like I was reciting fiction. My mom sat quietly at the table that night, not defending me, but not fully agreeing with him either, which at the time felt almost worse. I wanted someone in my corner, and instead I got silence. I enrolled in community college to keep the peace, studying business on the side, but I never stopped streaming. I'd go to class during the day and grind 10-hour streams at night, surviving on maybe 5 or 6 hours of sleep most days. My parents saw it as a phase, something I'd grow out of once real-life responsibilities set in. My mom would sigh every time she walked past my room and saw the ring light glowing under the door, that soft blue-white light spilling into the hallway like evidence of some crime. Sometimes she'd knock and ask, gently, if I'd thought about internships, about backup plans, about what I'd do if this whole thing didn't pan out. I always said I had a plan. I don't think she ever fully believed me. The turning point came when I was 19. Mid-size esports organization had been watching my growth for a few months, not just my gameplay, but how I ran my stream, how consistent I was, how I treated my community. They reached out about signing me, offering a small base salary plus a percentage of my sponsorship deals. It wasn't life-changing money, not even close, but it was proof. Real proof on paper with a company logo and a legal contract attached to it. I printed it out and drove straight to my parents' house, practically vibrating with excitement. I showed my dad the contract at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd once told me gaming would never be a real job. He glanced at it for maybe 3 seconds, his eyes skimming without really reading, and handed it back to me. "Contracts like this don't last," he said, already turning back to whatever he'd been doing before I walked in. "Enjoy it while it does." I remember standing there holding that piece of paper, feeling something in my chest go cold and hard. Not devastated exactly, I was almost past being devastated by then, but resolved. Something shifted in me that day. I stopped needing his approval to keep going. I decided quietly that I'd just keep building whether he believed in it or not, and eventually the results would speak louder than anything I could say to convince him. So I kept my head down and kept working. I studied the business side obsessively. Brand deals, tournament structures, audience retention curves, monetization strategies most streamers never bothered to learn because they were too focused on just playing the game. I read books on negotiation. I watched interviews with creators who'd built real companies out of their channels. I treated my stream less like a hobby and more like a startup, tracking metrics, testing content formats, building relationships with brands slowly and carefully instead of chasing every sponsorship offer that came my way. While other creators burned out chasing viral moments, jumping from trend to trend with no real foundation underneath them, I built something sustainable, brick by brick, week after week. I also started saying no to things a lot of creators my age said yes to. I turned down a couple of sponsorship deals early on that would have paid well but felt wrong for my audience, promoting products I didn't believe in or couldn't stand behind. A few people in my circle thought I was leaving money on the table. Maybe I was, in the short term. But every time I turned something down, I noticed my audience trusted me a little more, engaged a little longer, stuck around instead of drifting off to the next creator with flashier numbers and less substance behind them. That trust turned out to be worth more than any single check I could have cashed. By 21, I had over 500,000 subscribers across platforms. By 22, I'd started helping a few smaller streamers in my circle negotiate their own sponsorship deals, mostly because I kept getting asked for advice, and realized I actually enjoyed that side of things almost as much as playing. I liked untangling messy contracts, spotting the clauses that would quietly screw someone over 18 months down the line, helping people my age understand that they had more leverage than they thought. By 23, that informal advice had turned into a small content agency I'd co-founded with 2 other creators, helping streamers negotiate brand deals and structure their business, taking a modest cut of every deal we helped close. It wasn't glamorous work most days. A lot of it was spreadsheets, contract redlines, and late-night calls with brand managers in different time zones. But it was real, and it was mine. I never made a big announcement to my parents about any of it. Frankly, after years of being talked down to, I'd mostly stopped looking for their approval altogether. I'd call my mom occasionally, mention things in passing, a new sponsorship, a milestone subscriber count, hiring our first full-time employee, and she'd say something polite and non-committal, and we'd move on to other topics. My dad and I barely discussed it at all. Our conversations had narrowed down to sports scores and weather and whatever was wrong with his truck that week. I told myself I was fine with that distance. Most days I actually was. There were harder days too, if I'm honest. Holidays where extended family would ask what I was really doing with my life, and I'd watch my dad's jaw tighten before he changed the subject for me, like even he didn't want to explain it out loud. A cousin's wedding where an uncle cornered me by the bar and spent 20 minutes explaining why I should get serious, before it was too late, clearly working off information that was years out of date. I stopped correcting people eventually. It was easier to just nod and let them believe whatever they wanted, because the version of my life that lived in my family's head and the version I was actually living had drifted so far apart that trying to reconcile them in a 5-minute conversation felt pointless. Then, 5 years after that conversation in the kitchen, my dad called me. Not my mom, my dad, which was rare enough on its own that I actually stared at my phone for a second before answering, half expecting some kind of emergency. "Hey, Ryan," he said, and I could hear something off in his voice immediately, a heaviness that wasn't there in our usual small talk. "Do you have a minute? Your mother and I need to talk to you about something." I drove over that weekend, my mind running through every possible scenario on the way, most of them worse than what I actually found. They sat me down at the same kitchen table where he'd once told me gaming would never be a real job, the same table where he'd handed back my first contract without reading it. My dad wouldn't quite make eye contact, turning his coffee mug in slow circles on the table without drinking from it. My mom's hands were folded tightly in her lap, her knuckles pale. Turns out, my dad's shop had been struggling for almost 2 years. Bigger chain had opened up not far from his place, undercutting his prices and slowly pulling away customers who'd been loyal to him for over a decade. Competition tanked his business faster than he could adjust, and rather than tell anyone, he'd quietly taken out a second loan against the house to keep the shop afloat, convinced he could turn things around before anyone needed to know. It hadn't worked. Revenue kept sliding, the loan payments piled on top of the mortgage, and they were now 3 months behind, with the bank starting to send letters that used words like default and foreclosure proceedings. "We didn't want to ask you," my mom said, her voice cracking in a way I'd never heard before. "We really didn't, but we don't know who else to turn to, and I know that's not fair to put on you, but we're out of options." Sat there for a moment, letting it all sink in, watching my dad stare at the table like he couldn't bring himself to look at me. Every lecture came rushing back in that silence, every eye roll, every get a real job. Every time he'd handed back proof of my success like it was worthless. Part of me, and I'm not proud of this, wanted to make him sit in that discomfort a little longer. I wanted to ask if this hobby for kids who don't want to grow up was good enough to save their house now. I wanted, just for a second, to feel some version of vindication after years of being dismissed. But I didn't say any of that. I looked at my mom's face, and at my dad's hands still wrapped around that mug he wasn't drinking from, and whatever petty satisfaction I might have felt just quietly dissolved into something closer to concern. Instead, I asked them how much they needed. And my dad finally told me the number. I didn't even flinch, though I could tell by the way he watched my face that he expected me to. I'd built enough of a financial cushion over the past few years, between the agency and my own channel revenue, that I could cover it without touching anything critical to my business. I told them I'd pay off the mortgage balance and cover the missed payments in full on one condition. We sit down together, all three of us, and figure out a real plan for the shop, because a bailout without a plan was just delaying the exact same problem a few months down the road. My dad broke down crying at that kitchen table. I'd genuinely never seen him cry before, not once in my entire life, not at funerals, not at anything. Kept apologizing, saying he didn't know what to say, that he'd been so wrong about me for so long, that he didn't deserve this kind of help after everything he'd said over the years. My mom just kept whispering, "Thank you," over and over, gripping my hand across the table so tightly it almost hurt. I paid off the mortgage balance within the week, working with their lender directly to bring everything current and stop the foreclosure process before it could go any further. I also connected my dad with someone from my agency's network who specialized in helping small local businesses build an online presence, something my dad had always dismissed as unnecessary for a shop that had always run on word of mouth. He resisted the idea at first, grumbling about kids these days and their obsession with phones and screens, the same complaint he'd leveled at me 100 times growing up. But he agreed to try it, mostly because he didn't have much choice left. Within a few months, his shop actually started picking up new customers from the local Facebook groups and online reviews we helped set up, slowly clawing back some of the ground he'd lost to the bigger chain nearby. We spent a lot of Saturday mornings that year going over his books together at that same kitchen table, me explaining margins and customer acquisition the way he used to explain torque and compression ratios to me when I was a kid too young to really understand it. There was something almost funny about the role reversal, though neither of us said it out loud. He'd ask questions, actually listen to the answers, jot things down in the little notebook he kept in his shirt pocket. It was the most engaged he'd ever been with anything I had to say. These days, my dad doesn't call gaming a hobby anymore. Tells his buddies at the shop that his son runs a media company, which isn't exactly how I'd describe it, but I've stopped correcting him because I can hear the pride in his voice when he says it, something I never once heard growing up. He still doesn't fully understand what I do day to day. He'll ask questions sometimes that make it obvious he thinks I'm still just playing games for a living, but the respect is there now in a way it never used to be. He asks about my business the way he used to ask about my grades, genuinely curious, actually listening to the answers instead of waiting for his turn to lecture me. I don't hold a grudge over what he said all those years ago. Not really, not anymore. He was scared for me in his own stubborn, old-fashioned way, worried I'd end up chasing something that would leave me with nothing to show for it. I understand that fear a lot better now that I run a business myself and worry about things I never used to think about: payroll, contracts falling through, market shifts I can't control. But I'll admit there was a quiet kind of peace in that moment at the kitchen table, watching him cry for the first time in my life, not because I won, some argument I'd been carrying around for years, but because I finally got to show him, without saying a single word, that I'd built something real, something solid enough to catch him when he needed it most. Sometimes, late at night after I finish a stream, I'll think back to that 17-year-old kid sitting in his childhood bedroom, ring light glowing under a closed door, absolutely certain he was building something worthwhile even when the two people whose opinion mattered most to him couldn't see it yet. I don't know if I'd tell him to do anything differently. I think I'd just tell him to hang on a little longer because eventually, the numbers do the talking, and eventually, even the most stubborn people come around.